I'm going to hand over to Julie to speak for about half an hour, and then we'll move on to having a discussion where people can raise their hands and make contributions or ask questions for the rest of the meeting. And then at the end of that, Julie will have a chance to sum up and come back on any questions. So thanks, over to Julie.
Okay, thanks very much, Ruby. And can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Well, I don't know how everybody else is feeling coming to a meeting about the anti-vaxx movement. It obviously kind of brings your mind back to like this time a couple of years ago, and there is a bit of a kind of cognitive dissonance in lots of ways of, sitting in a room, full of so many people, and it's brilliant to have everybody back at, Marxism for the debates and discussion. But it's quite hard to kind of put your mind back into that mindset of the early pandemic days when the anti-vaxx movement emerged. And I think, going back roughly to this time 2 years ago, we were emerging out of the first wave of deadly pandemic that has, according to the British Medical Journal in an article last month, killed close to 15 million people worldwide. We were in the depths of a lockdown and facing a government here in Britain and a ruling class across the world who had murderously mishandled the pandemic from the very start, putting the profit drive of the system blatantly before people's lives. And I don't know, it feels quite far away to think back to that time now, but there was an intensity to that time, I think, especially for people who maybe were worried about being more vulnerable, or that they were close to people who were more vulnerable to perhaps being killed by the virus and so on. That to have to go through that situation with a system that failed to provide health workers with adequate PPE, failed to effectively lock down in the way that could actually contain the spread of the virus, and that sense that there was no or little protection going to work. I've heard the case of Belly Majinga, the train worker who was mentioned in a couple of meetings this morning, which really brings it back for you. Somebody who went into work, said to the management in work that they didn't feel safe, that they were vulnerable, that they felt vulnerable because of the virus, that they needed protection, that they needed PPE, and who were forced to work despite not being given that safety provision, and who encountered what was quite likely a racist attack on the platform. And subsequently died as a result of coming into contact with someone who had spat on her. It's a terrible case and brings the question back to class, I think, as well. But I think it does remind us, really of what that moment was like. So the whole kind of phenomena that we witnessed in that moment of the emergence of an anti-vax movement, big mobilisations, resisting lockdowns and vaccines, kind of fueled by conspiracy theory politics, was a quite remarkable and worrying development. Particularly when you think that it came off the back of Trumpism, the rise of the alt-right, the growth of the far right, and so-called culture wars, anti-woke narratives that were being brought to quite big audiences through the use of social media and big funding that was going into that. So at this moment, I think we did see across the mainstream liberal press the arguments of the conspiracy theory movement that had emerged were ridiculed, and people found it quite a fascinating phenomenon. And I think it was right, any of us that had friends or workmates or so on that you ended up in conversations with in your social circles, it was right, I think, to argue quite hard and fast against, the notion that COVID was caused by 5G, or that the vaccines were actually all about a way to implant microchips into the masses, and that we had to go away and read all these Google articles, and that was the best way that we could spend our time. I think it was right to challenge this conspiracy theory direction of an interpretation of what was going on, not because it's wild or wrong to challenge or disbelieve the establishment narrative, or that it's wrong or wild to think that there's something deeply dodgy, wrong, and sinister going on in the world. I think that reaction is actually fairly logical to the situation that we're forced to exist in. But because conspiracy theory politics should be challenged, because I think it's a trajectory that does not lead people to effective organisation and resistance, but instead actually contributes to open up a quite dangerous space that becomes a breeding ground for the far right, and that can only really lead in that direction amidst the crisis. So I want to kind of go on and sort of talk through why I think the conspiracy theories had a purchase, and contrast the kind of alternatives to that kind of response to the crisis and the pandemic, and trying to understand the world. So I think the root of the appeal that the conspiracy theories can have is that the world around us, the experience of human existence under capitalism, doesn't really make sense. So Marx said that the prevailing ideas in a society are the ideas of the ruling class, And so we grow up in a world where our understanding of the world around us is shaped by the ideology that comes out of the capitalist system. And this is a system that's underpinned by the drive to accumulate profit, that's based on the exploitation of the working class, and a political system and state that organises to both obscure that reality and also justify it in a kind of in a simultaneous kind of contradictory way. I'm sure we could go through lots of examples of. So I think in our day-to-day experience of our lives, it is really a struggle to make sense of and make sense and process these deep contradictions in the needs and the logic of human existence, and contrast that with the way that the world is run under capitalism. And now we're amidst this deepening crisis of the capitalist system. It's been referred to as a triple crisis. The pandemic is a kind of acceleration of this. Coupled with an intensifying ecological disaster, growing climate chaos, coming on the back of over a decade of austerity and the very hard material impact that it's having on people. And you look at the cost of living crisis as it hits, the result ideologically for this in the movement is that the kind of deepening alienation, political polarisation that emanates out of the economic crisis. Basically, people are trying to process what the hell is going on around them and why the world doesn't, these things don't add up. So I think it's a big question about ideas and how people interpret the nonsensical experience of life under present era capitalism. And so it isn't surprising that we see a growth in conspiracy theories, and that this actually, we have to understand it as part of a rejection of and a distrust of the establishment's narrative. So we've seen this collapse of the mainstream centre politically as polarisation has deepened, where a shift has really taken place, I would say, in the last 10 to 15 years, where people are no longer accepting the neoliberal centre politics kind of narrative of the world, where we've seen this played out in a series of breaks, where we've had centre parties that dominated for so long kind of collapsing in elections, the rise of far left parties such as Syriza in Greece, Podemos in the Spanish state, Bernie Sanders in America, Corbynism. You can also see the collapse of the Labour Party in Scotland and the rise of the independence movement within that kind of same pattern. And the other side of it is that we've seen the rise of the far right, the Trumpism, so really you can see Trumpism's grown out of that space, Bolsonaro, across Europe. The most recent kind of ringing example of it is the how well fascist Le Pen and her national rally has done in France. They've really consolidated, and I know that the centre mainstream kind of political establishment would like to say, it's a celebration for Macron and centre politics and so on. Really, if you look at the gains that Le Pen and the fascists have made, it's definitely a worrying symbol that shows how they're able to grow out of the crisis. And so I think essentially there's a battle for ideas for this ground, this anti-establishment reaction to the ravages of the system amidst the crisis. And so many can be drawn to the conspiracy theories sort of way of responding, and I think that the reason for this is kind of threefold. Firstly, these ideas have purchase because the ruling class can and do act conspiratorially. So if you look at the history of class-divided society, it's a history of scandals, cover-ups, lies. When I was wanting to write this in a short way, it was actually quite difficult to pick out what examples to refer to, because there are so many. But this year it's 50 years since Bloody Sunday in Derry, where the British state murdered people on a civil rights demonstration, including many teenagers, covered it up and smeared those who were killed. The story of Hillsborough is a similar story. We know, obviously we're all too aware of the current scandals around Partygate, which can seem like a kind of lighter, jokey kind of thing, but actually at the same time we should always remember that it's essentially they partied while working class people died because they didn't provide an adequate response to the crisis. There's spy cops, the hacking scandal of a decade ago, and of course, the whole abuse scandal that emerged heavily implicated the Tory party that they systematically covered up. So I think it's understandable why people can look to hear conspiracy theories and think, yeah, there is something really dodgy going on here. I don't trust the politicians. I don't trust the establishment, and I feel driven to go and find out more about what they're up to and what's actually going on. This drive to find the truth and uncover and so on. I know it's quite old now, although I saw that it was added to Netflix or Amazon Prime at some point. So maybe people watched it again in the pandemic if they were too young to watch it the first time. But the Danish Scandi noir series, The Killing, actually I think does this really, really well, where it does explore the kind of, you know, murky sort of interrelationship at, you know, at the level of, at the point of power of the ruling class, you know, the scandals, the horrific you know, murders and all this kind of murky business. But actually it does kind of bring it back to understanding the logic of the system that that drives the ruling class to act in that way. And so, you know, it's absolutely true that there is abuse, corruption, you know, power and scandal at the top of the system. So, yeah, that sense that something terrible is going on, something sinister and twisted, that we're systematically lied to, you know, comes out of the fact that we are lied to and we shouldn't trust the establishment. The second reason, I think, is, you know, is probably, you know, one of the more important points to stress, which is that there's a class basis and a political context for the emergence of conspiracy theories. So, you know, the prevalence of conspiracy theories and how they can hold greater sway inside the movement at any given moment is connected to the balance of forces in the movement and the balance of class forces. So, you know, for example, I became active politically in the anti-war movement. I was a school student that walked out against the war. And, you know, at that height of the movement, you know, in, you know, 2003, I'm sure it was a very big movement, you know, there were 2 million people that marched and so on, it was a global movement. I'm sure there were conspiracy theories all around the fringes of that, but your actual participation in the movement, you didn't really necessarily feel that this was a kind of dominant narrative that was coming out. People were marching together, coming together, you know, and so on. But actually, as the movement kind of developed, and, you know, by no means do I think that the anti-war movement, you know, was a failure or that it was pointless or didn't lead to anything. I think it was a massive impact on the ruling class and what they were able to do next, but it didn't stop the war. And I think that there were, you know, millions of people who were involved in that movement, that as the movement kind of, you know, began to decline or dissipate in that way, that was when you started to kind of feel that sense that people thought, like, well, we went out and we marched in our millions, you know, there's no democracy, they ignore us, you know, there were a lot of you know, scandals and kind of relationships of what was going on with the question of oil and profit and so on, about the motives behind driving the war on terror and everything. So I think at that point, that was when you did start to see in that declining moment of the movement, you know, a greater sense of looking towards conspiracy theories. And I think, you know, what I would have argued with people at the time really is that, you know, that 9/11 was the big one. Do I think that the ruling class are capable of such a horrific thing? You know, I do, because they were doing it at the time, and you know, in Basra and Palestine. You know, so I think that the danger was that a lot of those arguments around the kind of conspiracy theory end would bog you down and sort of having to go away and sort of research and debate the ins and outs of, you know, was 9/11 an inside job and all these things, when really actually you know, we should be out on the streets mobilising on the basis of the very clear things that they are doing in the course of the war. And so I think this is also kind of, you know, the purchase of these ideas is also kind of shaped by a low level in class struggle. So, you know, I was thinking about how am I doing for time, by the way? Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, when I was thinking about doing this meeting, it was like lots of things come into your head, because it's, you know, I'm looking forward to hearing what people can bring into the discussion, because I think it is an interesting discussion that brings in a lot of things. I was thinking back to like various discussions I'd had at certain points with, you know, old schoolmates and stuff. You know, I grew up in a working class area of Glasgow, went to school in Ibrox and stuff, and you know, that way you catch up with people years later and they're like, what do you do? And you're like, oh, I organise our unions and strikes and anti-racism and stuff, and that opens up a lot of discussions. And I noticed this kind of phenomenon with quite a few people that, you know, you get in touch with who would, oh, that's very interesting, but like a lot of them were coming up with like a lot of conspiracy theory stuff, and they weren't the people that were like union members or were particularly involved in the movement. And I remember having these arguments with them at the time. And in the end, it came down to one of them who'd said, you know, well, I'd love a revolt. The London riots kind of showed that people would group together, but I don't think it would be ever on a big enough scale to bring down a government. Then stopped to kind of talk about some zeitgeist post that, you know, they read about, and then came back to the question of saying, you know, I know I sound really pessimistic, but, you know, I have a feeling in the back of my head that it would all end up in vain and so on. And so people are going through, I think, quite a sort of intense process of how they're trying to understand the world around them, and they're doing that in the context of particular, you know, rises and falls in the struggle. And so that particular conversation was in late 2012. So the previous year you'd have 2.5 million people on strike together, you'd had a mass student revolt, you'd had the Arab Spring, but by this point, those movements had declined or been sold out, and my analysis, that wouldn't be a pessimistic one at all. I think that people it wasn't, I wouldn't describe that as a downturn or anything, but at that time, there was a kind of drawback in that kind of forward-footed fight. There was counter-revolution around the Arab Spring and so on. And so I think it's not surprising that people who are not involved in those day-to-day political arguments and discussions are it's this swirl of ideas, really. Actually, it wasn't a common response in the more active sections of the movement. People can tell me if their experience is different, like trade union members and so on. That was more a case, I think, of where people felt like they'd looked to mass strikes, they'd looked to the concept of a general strike, they wanted to be out on strike, they wanted to fight the Tories. When that didn't happen, you kind of had an emergence of Corbynism, you had the emergence of the independence movement, and I think that there was a kind of sense of people in the more organised section of the working class movement looking more to, I suppose, kind of reformist solutions of one kind or another. So I think it's always rooted in that kind of balance of class forces about how much purchase these ideas have. I think it's also important to look at the class basis for conspiracy theory politics and the makeup of some of the anti-lockdown and anti-vax mobilisations that emerged, because there was a sense, and this was kind of echoed in maybe Guardian articles you might have read or so on, looking at what was going on, that it was a working class expression, and we had the same argument around about the same time. Around about the same time as fascist Tommy Robinson was trying to build his street armies, whether it was through the English Defence League or whether it was the more recent Football Lads Alliance and the so-called Democratic Football Lads Alliance. Actually, of course, these interventions can and do have purchase among working class people, as I've just kind of looked at, but I think and particularly those not keyed into organised sections of the class movement, but actually the social basis of these mobilisations was clearly a factor in many of the lockdown protests, was not the working class. You look at the rise of the anti-vax movements, and I think you can kind of see it as an expression of the impact of the pandemic on sections of, the middle class, mixed in with the kind of general mistrust of politicians, a lack of collective response. So these movements can be dominated by conspiracy theory politics, by kind of libertarian notions of individual freedoms being attacked. The far right and fascists are operating inside these movements, alongside a milieu of incel, misogynists and so on, but it's in no way reducible to those really nasty elements, but the kind of basis on which people, there was an interesting article or interview, I think, that Richard Donnelly, who might have been in this meeting, but I think he's actually got COVID, so we'll send him our best wishes, but he actually went round and spoke to a lot of people on one of the early anti-lockdown mobilisations at Trafalgar Square, and it was a lot of people who were kind of, running their own businesses, or, that kind of layer of people who actually were really materially being impacted very, very badly by the lockdown and by the pandemic and so on. So, I think that's important to kind of look a little bit at the sort of dynamic of the class dynamic that's present there, and how the crisis impacts different kind of class sections. The third reason why I think that these ideas have purchase is the logic of conspiracy theory politics does emerge out of these material and social conditions and has a class basis, but they don't emerge entirely, sort of spontaneously or organically just out of thin air. There are actually, organised interventions of people, in the same way that, I think socialists should make organised interventions into the battle for ideas, into what we should do amidst the crisis. We organise and we intervene and we make an argument about what should happen. The far right do this too. And so if you look at a lot of the origins and the drive behind some of the big conspiracy theories, there is actually often direct evidence of an intervention by fascists at the far right. There's an active attempt to use conspiracy theories as a ground to mobilise on, and so you can see this is the case with QAnon, and I'll quote Richard Wittgenstein because he's not here. And in one of the articles that he's written quite a lot about this, is where he said, QAnon is not so much a conspiracy theory as a bustling ecosystem of bizarre hypotheses, paranoid fantasies, and far right ideological motifs. At its core is the idea that President Trump is part of a group of high-level patriots who are working to expose the real rulers of the US, a secret satanic society of liberal politicians, faceless bureaucrats and bankers, referred to as the cabal. So you can see that the far right have actually that's an intervention that they're trying to make into the crisis. It was the same with people know about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a kind of fabricated anti-Semitic text, which was supposedly meant to be announcing a Jewish plan for global domination. It was first published in Russia in 1903. Was sort of put out internationally in the early part of the 20th century, and was a key part and a key deliberate part of developing the anti-Semitic trope of an international global conspiracy and so on. The Jewish Bolshevism, anti-Semitic trope and anti-communist, anti-Bolshevik trope, which alleges that Jewish people were the originators of the Russian Revolution, and also you can see it very present. The White Army, the counter-revolution in Russia, printed this pamphlet and was putting out racist propaganda, using this trope and this conspiracy theory. There's loads of other examples, but I think I'm going to run out of time, so I'll leave that to the discussion. But I think it leads us to a question of trying to understand where the conspiracy theories come from, what the kind of dynamic and logic of where they lead you is as a way of trying to understand the world. And I think we have to kind of contrast that with a Marxist understanding of the world, a Marxist method. What is that? It's something that has a purpose and it has a punchline, and it explains the logic of the capitalist system. It explains how the ruling class is driven and constrained by the logic of competitive accumulation of capital. It explains how that leads them to unite and ensuring through the arms of the state that the exploitation of the working class is maintained. The systematic oppression. We've been in meetings this morning about institutional racism and so on. Such as racism, sexism, LGBT plus phobia. All these things are something that operates systematically inside the capitalist system to maintain it and to keep our class divided. And so I think Marxism can also explain, as much as it's a terrible logic, there is a logic to the capitalist system. The reason that we see, increasing wars, imperialist rivalries, and so on is because, while the ruling class are united in their attempts to keep us exploited and keep us oppressed, they're not united when it comes to the competition of the accumulation of capital, and this can break down by state or it can break down by individual capitalist companies and so on. And I think that's important because I think a lot of the conspiracy theory sort of descriptions. Come on. Sorry, somebody tell the mics that I'll be done soon. Where was I? It's often based on this kind of half appreciation of something that does happen in society, but without actually giving any kind of real attempt to actually understand and explain it. And then a lot of the attempts to explain it are fabricated and kind of baseless. I think someone in an article, I can't remember who it was, that I was reading, pointed out that there's a bit of a hypocrisy, and John Molyneux, there's a hypocrisy in the way that a lot of the conspiracy theories really, intensely sort of forensically attack the sort of narrative that they're challenging, but then actually behind the narrative that they're presenting as an alternative, there's very little rigorous testing going on there at all. I think that it's important to understand and contrast that kind of the difference of what Marxism as a method and an understanding of things can offer, because it also offers us an explanation and understanding of what the force for change is. It also gives us something that we can do, because the whole system is based upon the exploitation of the working class. That means that the system has created its own gravedigger, as Marx said, and so because everything in society that happens, all the profits of the rich and so on, are produced by people getting up every day in their masses and going to work and being exploited for a wage that's less the value than their labour. When they strike, when they take action, when they occupy, when they protest, when we do that en masse, we don't only cause disruption. The RMT strikes are wonderful because they're going to be, they're powerful and they do have an impact. But they also hit the bosses where it hurts, and their profits. I'd like to find out what the impact on the City of London was and so on of those strikes. And good, that's our class fighting back, and we do want to inflict blows on the people that are subjecting us to this awful system. So I think that kind of offers us the explanation of how we can fight back, why it's important that we win the battle for ideas in the movement that doesn't lead us down the garden path of having to feel like we have to go away and research hours and hours on Google or YouTube or whatever the sources that people send that are often quite shoddy, but that instead we need to be out on the streets, we need to be arguing with working class people and giving them confidence that we have collective power, we need to fight back, we should reject the racist narratives, the transphobic narratives, the sexist narratives, and we should unite and break down division and act to end this horrific system. And I think, how long have we got now?
About 7 minutes.
Oh, 7 minutes, okay. Yeah, because I think, one of the things to kind of grasp is that the conspiracy theory thing, it does leave you isolated. It's a quite individualistic and ultimately quite cynical direction, even for people who kind of buy into it, not because they're the far right or they're trying to, manipulate the situation. Because at best, even if you are looking out for it to try and convince people of anything, it's often a kind of drive to enlighten ignorant masses, or it can fall into that kind of attitude. The nature of your relationship to others can actually be quite cynical and quite dismissive of the question of working class agency. So you kind of have a situation. It's interesting, looking through all the different articles over the past few years of the kind of the kind of liberal response, which was similar to that what we saw around Brexit, I think, and how the liberal kind of establishment has tried to explain what happened in the rise of Trumpism and so on, where these working class people are stupid and ignorant for believing such outlandish things or being pulled in by racist ideas, and we have to get back to the kind of sensible centre, please, and that's why Macron's election is so brilliant and all these things. But when you look at the conspiracy theory response, it's actually kind of there is an echo of it in it, where it is similarly dismissive and cynical about the ability for working class people to fight back. This has happened badly because I've lost a page there. Oh yeah, okay. Sorry. I did want to talk about this example though. It's not an entirely surprising coincidence given the class basis for these ideas, and that this was reflected in the mobilisations, that it was small business owners, entrepreneurs, people who were hammered by the pandemic and the lockdown, people with no relationship to the organised collective working class response, or the trade union movement and so on. It's not that surprising that there's this kind of both views, I think, actually, whether it's a conspiracy theory view or whether it's the dismissal of the conspiracy theory view by the liberal press and so on, are patronising to working class people. I think actually when you look at it, there's a whole interesting series of things that I hope people can come up and discuss more in the discussion, where there are examples where working class forces have moved or reacted in a quite serious way around the question of the anti-vax movement. So there was an example in Australia where a Labour government in Victoria threatened to impose a vaccine mandate, and it was vigorously opposed, including by construction workers who were actually organised by a kind of left-led union. And so the left-led union was obviously putting out stuff saying, this is terrible, like the vaccine mandate's important. Sections of the left went along with saying that we had to have an alliance with the Labour governments and get behind the mandate. We have to mandate workers to have this vaccine. And actually, the headquarters of the union was attacked by construction workers, by its own members who were pissed off that there was a complete lack of recognition of the issues, that why workers might not want the state to be imposing a mandate. Now, I'm sure there'll be a discussion that will come out in the debate about the vaccine mandates, but I think it was a similar situation where we were faced with the question of the vaccine mandate for NHS workers came up. Because I do think we have to be careful how we understand and relate to these. Do we think that, people can say what they think. Do I think that health workers should be vaccinated at the height of a pandemic? Yes, I do. I hope that they will get vaccinated. I think it does make a difference. Do I agree with giving the state powers to enforce this and sack people if they don't? No, I don't. I don't think that that's a class position that socialists should take. And also you look at, I can see Karen at the back of the room, who obviously was organised a safe, socially distanced protest. I think she's one of the few people in this room with a mask actually on. About the lack of PPE and so on, and was faced with a 10 grand fine, by the state. So I don't think that we have to always be clear about the kind of class basis for the positions that we take around this. And there are a lot of arguments here about a mix of issues about why people might have not got the vaccine, why people are against it. Certainly I think I knew personally a lot of black health workers who didn't get the vaccine. I know that there's there's a knowledge of deep institutional racism in society, and there's an understandable reason why people made all kinds of decisions about whether or not they got the vaccine or not. But I do think that these are not particularly new arguments necessarily about scepticism about vaccines. Going right back to the smallpox vaccine, there was a movement around rejecting that. They see a growing thing about people not wanting to vaccinate children and so on, and that's a debate that we can kind of have, because obviously capitalism is bad for our health. There's lots and lots of things that I wouldn't trust it with at all. So I can understand why people want to kind of actually say, well, why should I just accept this is the best thing? In the same way that if there was another meeting at Marxism, which there has been in past years over capitalism and food, we could see that capitalism does actually poison us in a lot of different ways. It's not I don't think that we should be completely dismissive of those arguments, but I do think that the question of vaccines also has to be put in a kind of social context, which is that often we're encouraged in capitalism that we're all individuals and we're all just kind of these atomised people making decisions. Actually, if you look at sort of proof of the process of what's happened with vaccination programmes and why it's been important, it's a social argument, I think, about why people should why we would be in favour of people choosing to get vaccines. That's maybe some food for the discussion. So the far right are really using this ground in a serious way, and I think these ideas and the mobilisations that can gather around them can become quite a dangerous force in the movement, particularly at times of deep crisis, and that is when they tend to emerge. There's nothing particularly new in that. You look at conspiracy theory politics being used as a means to galvanise an alienated layer, on an anti-establishment basis, played its part at the rise of the Nazis in Germany. They used this to grow amidst the polarisation and ideological chaos of the crisis. I'll save some of the stuff about the picture of the far right for afterwards, so people can come up with it in the discussion. But if you look at Trumpism and the far right in the last few years, it's really been about galvanising that anti-establishment reaction, and it's been about trying to counter the growth of the left, and it's about trying to challenge working class organisation. So from the backlash to Me Too, to what's happening now with abortion rights, to the culture wars, anti-woke politics, this is all a big battle for ideas going on. I think that you look in the aftermath of the Second World War, the scale of the horror of the Holocaust, 6 million dead, there was a consensus across the mainstream of establishment politics that really there was a line that if it was crossed, it would put those political forces out on the extreme fringe, and this whole kind of gathering of the centre, that there are things that Boris Johnson has said publicly and so on that Theresa May would not have done, or David Cameron would not have done. There's been a shift. I think David Cameron and Theresa May are also racist. Theresa May is the architect of the hostile environment. But I think that there has been a shift of racist populism into the mainstream in terms of British politics. The rise of Trumpism, this is all coming out of the polarisation as the crisis is attacking people, really, and the system can't come up with a narrative at the top, so there's a political crisis there. And, we think about 2021, which began with fascist storming of Capitol Hill, which is all in the press again now, about the nature of what actually happened there. Trump is gone, but Trumpism is not gone. Trump's influence on the racist, populist and far right on a global scale was absolutely enormous. You look at what's happening in Poland, in Hungary, Brazil. I think it's right that we've consistently argued that Trump is not a fascist, but certainly he is fanning the flames of and opening the space and endorsing fascists and allowing fascist forces to grow from Charlottesville to Capitol Hill. And so there's nothing new about this kind of interaction of fascist forces, racist populism, far right forces. The different kind of methods that those different forces use at different points to try and gain an audience. You can break down the current makeup of things. We have the kind of classical fascism, which the best example of would be Golden Dawn, who the movement really defeated a couple of years ago through a mass united front method of being on the streets and challenging them. You have Eurofascism. You look at the likes of Marine Le Pen or the FPO in Austria, who have kind of put on the suits and tried to sanitise and detoxify the image. And that's a lot of stuff you could say around the French election about that strategy and how effective it can be. You have the street armies, which it's a key element of the fascist strategy, but it's not necessarily purely fascist movements at their height. They can pull in a whole manner of forces, and often fascist forces will try to intervene in these, spaces and try and win political leadership of them. And then we have racist populism, which describes a whole range of forces that are not fascist, from Trump to Farage to Sebastian Kurz in Austria, Johnson, and the current Tory party cabinet and so on. So I think, at the moment, I suppose the point to stress, because I've kind of run out of time, is that when you look at the anti-lockdown protests, the anti-vaxx movement and so on, there's a whole kind of swirl of different ideas that are coming into that as people are trying to grapple with, understanding the world around them, the crisis, what's happening, and are reacting against it as well. People are being radicalised, people are being polarised, politics is being polarised. But these, when you actually follow through the logic of what, conspiracy theory ideas offer you as a method to challenge, understand, and change the world, they are actually quite dangerous and lead you in a quite isolated path. Also, these spaces have become, and are a space where the far right and fascists are organising and trying to go from, for example, the pitiful state that the fascist and the far right are in organisationally right now in Britain. They now want to get a big audience inside these movements, and they're fighting in that battle of ideas to pull people. They're saying, yes, you're right to reject the establishment politics. The establishment politics has let you down. It's about racism. It's about all these refugees that are coming in. It's about this. The left and socialists and revolutionaries, anti-racists, we have to be just as loud, we have to be just as organised, we have to build mass movements on a united front method where we bring together everybody to oppose fascists, to oppose racism. Doesn't matter if you disagree on other issues, like we did when we stopped fascist Tommy Robinson, and like we have to do to mobilise against what the government is doing now in terms of the intensification of racist policy. But we do have to understand as well that these things are intrinsic to the system, and we need to build revolutionary organisation that can fight for that kind of scale of class response that we're beginning to get a little taste of in the RMT strikes. We have power, and we need to fight back and fight to change the world.
So we're going to have a discussion now where I'm going to ask people to raise their hands if they want to make a contribution. And I'm also going to limit those contributions to 3 minutes so that we can hear from as many people as possible. In order to do that, when you've had 2 minutes, I'm going to tap on the mic just to let you know that you've got a minute left. And then when you've had 3 minutes, I'll ask you to sum up and finish off so we can move on to the next person. So if you indicate, I'll just call people in one at a time. Thanks. We'll start off here. It's going to be a roaming mic. So.
Yeah, I think a lot of what I see of conspiracy theories and the anti-vax movement stems from fear, because so much of what has happened, especially in the last 2 years, has been terrifying. From a global pandemic where hundreds of thousands of people died, thinking that there was a virus that could kill everyone is terrifying. So then suddenly saying, well, no, it's not real, that's kind of like a defense mechanism. And QAnon particularly plays on this with the idea that school shootings are fake, because it's so scary that anything, someone could walk in with an AR-15 and kill a bunch of children. No, it's not real. It can't hurt me. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, so that's my...
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Karen Nyson from Manchester. I would say it was a really interesting talk, and I do think that... I'll keep going, it works. I do think that one of the reasons why right-wing anti-vaccine conspiracy get a hearing is because they start with the fact that the world is wrong. And for most people, I think they agree that the world is wrong. And the Tories presented a narrative that half the time had some truth in it, but half the time was completely incoherent, unscientific and inconsistent, and therefore it opened the door to people. I didn't trust what they said. I didn't get my science from the government. I got my science from Independent Sage or from Socialist Worker because I trusted those sources. But I had access to them, lots of people didn't. And I think the other thing is there was no articulation of any of the opposition to the way that the Tories chose to manage it. So that the Labour Party were just backing them all the way down the line, saying we're not going to come disagree with you over COVID. And that meant there wasn't anybody saying sort of, that this is wrong, that you're doing this wrong or you're doing that wrong and people are dying unnecessarily and you should be doing X, Y and Z. And I think that did open the door. And it isn't just the Labour Party, it was the trade unions. We tried, I'm a health worker, we tried to organise opposition, but we did it not just in the face of the police, not just in the face of the government, but also in the face of our union who didn't want to back us doing it. And lots of people said we shouldn't be doing protests, and we did protests about PPE in order to save people's lives, and we were accused of putting people at risk for doing it. When we tried to protest about sort of the 1% pay rise, which was going to drive more health workers out, I got a £10,000 fine for doing that. And you just think that, my union said to me, I'll back you at work, but I'm not backing you in the courts, and we're not paying a penny of your fine. Now, fortunately, working class people are a lot more sensible than that, and they gave in their thousands, and we covered the fine easily, which in the end I never paid. Compensation, and that's because working class people stood together. But you have to stand up and be counted, and unfortunately on the sort of the establishment left, that wasn't there, and I think that opens the door to conspiracy theorists and makes it much easier for people. And I think they then say, we know best and you're stupid for not knowing best, and it's actually not one that mobilises people, it's one that undermines the majority and doesn't encourage collective activity. But you can see where it comes out. It has a base in the complete inability of reformism to deliver when people's lives were on the line.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I can just talk really loudly? Is that
yeah, great.
Yeah. Just talk. Oh, whoa. Comes back. It's an emotional one. I think Karen's point was really important about the failure of the reformist organisations, both the Labour Party and the trade unions, in terms of creating a fertile ground for conspiracy theories. I think that the other really important thing that sometimes gets left out of discussion is I do think the most important driving force in the conspiracy theories is about the growth of the far right. And I think that one of the examples of that, and the way you said it, is it's kind of, you forget about it now, but at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, most of the European far right were not anti-vax or anti-lockdown, they were anti-immigrant and pro-lockdown. They said all these filthy non-white people have come to our countries and they're spreading our disease, or all of these horrible immigrants that come from Poland or other places in Europe, they're spreading COVID, this is why we need harsher immigration policies. And they saw lockdowns as a potential for potentially bringing in laws that could continue to be used. The attitude was not we're against vaccines in the same way that it developed. The key thing that transformed that was the attitude of the American far right and Trump, who shaped politically what has now kind of come to be the right-wing, mainstream right-wing position of being anti-conspiracy theory. Obviously, that is not to say that anti-vax, it's not to say that everyone who is anti-vax is a right-winger, but I think it's important to see where that comes from, and that's different from some of the conspiracy theories that dominated during the Iraq War. There were plenty of people who were left-wing, who were important left-wing figures who believed in conspiracy theories that the American government they had done September 11th. Especially in Australia, that was a really big strain of some left-wing thought. Socialists argued against that because obviously if you just see it as a single conspiracy theory, not as a question of imperialism or capitalism or the nature of the way society is ruled, that's a barrier and a limitation towards people coming to more political positions, to pushing a movement forward, to having a left-wing movement. That is very different from where the conspiracy theories around COVID and the vaccines are coming from today. And I actually think the Australian example of the demonstration that happened outside of the union building is the perfect example. The CFMEU is not a left-wing union. They're a historically militant union, but they're one of the most right-wing, top-down, controlling union that exists in Australia. They're also a union that is being marked out in Australia as, during the COVID pandemic, one of the most anti-lockdown and anti-health measure unions. They were thanked by the government for being a union that managed to keep their industry open when the rest of Australia was going into lockdown. The head of the CFMEU worked with the government to keep a non-essential industry open so that bosses could continue to make profit during the lockdown. Their anti-health measure policy created a situation within that section of workers where, when they're surveyed, construction workers in Australia have vastly worse attitudes towards health measures around COVID than any other section of workers, including other blue-collar workers, including other healthcare workers. It is that failure of those reformists, coupled with the far right, because the demonstrations were dominated by the far right and organised more by the far right than construction workers in Australia, that created a situation where you saw these violent anti-union protests. There are vaccine mandates in Perth, in Sydney, in almost every state in Australia. The only place you saw those demonstrations was in Victoria, which has the biggest far right of anywhere in Australia.
Right, thanks very much to begin with for the talk that we've got on, and thanks to everyone else for your brilliant questions so far. I apologise, I guess I don't have anything to directly follow these questions, much as I'd prefer to build on them in the interest of a discussion. I suppose I find myself with a larger question coming out of this discussion of conspiracy theories. And that question is as such, comrades, what can we as leftists, considering the actions in this pandemic and the conspiracy theories, do to reclaim the means of circulation? Right, and the means of spreading messages and adequate information amidst a system that is dedicated by all means and purposes to distort it, right? Like most of us in here, I'm very much a fan of Marx as a theorist, right? But I think he's primarily a theorist who covers means of production rather than of circulation, right? Which in some ways leaves him a bit blindsided for these issues within the pandemic of information, right? Marx speaks of information, of culture, of communicative messages as a direct function of a production basis rather than something that's almost entirely independent or automated, right? And this is something that I think is very much exposed to us by the success of the far right in distorting these sorts of messages, right? As we've mentioned many times in the talk, there's almost no connection between production of vaccines or policies that are going on and the messages the right has been able to spread. The far right's been able to undermine its own institutional state, radically transform how people see these issues just through spreading these conspiracy theories without actually producing anything and simply by distorting this information. And to my mind, that's been a subversive action to begin with, but it's led to them building up their own institutions as well. They're forming these alternative sets of institutions after this subversion of what's gone on through the means of circulation, right? And to the contrary, I often see leftist movements to this as being impeded a bit, right? As being focused simply on what Jody Dean calls communicative capitalism, right? The analogy, the misconception rather, that the means we have of expressing our ideas are democratic and will help us create change, right? This simple idea that making our voices heard, but more so an abundance and excess of these messages will actually do something, will create change, right? It's led in some cases simply to continued horizontal stagnation and a sole ability to be prefigurative that's prevented people from forming their own counter-narratives to very successful right-wing attempts to be subversive via this media, right? And I wonder how we ourselves can use this effort to build up new channels of communication, new channels of spreading abilities to bring people together, to reinforce the messages of solidarity, of togetherness, of the power of collective action that ultimately ties back to production. Thanks very much to everyone for their questions.
My name is Sam Sagara, perhaps best known as a phenomenon, social, political, and what I would call international scandal, for which I'm very much disliked and liked otherwise by few, not a lot. But I'm trying to say one thing more. That at the advent of Trumpism, when he was elected, there is a book by one gentleman, Professor Emeritus of California University, Berkeley campus. Please try to read it, understand the category of which I'm convinced we all must do. It is called confrontation, political domination by public body. By public body, you understand? Because this is very serious psychological on people, mainly black people, who they look at human rights and political activism on the left. I don't really care when anybody confines me because I'm capable to define me, but I'm social rather than socialist because anybody I see as with the eyes, ears, nose, I look at him as my fellow human being in Africa. Bantu man, that Bantu means Muntu, a person only, that he's special creation by God, that without him, I mean, you are because I am, without you, I can never be existing. So I will defend you the point where I risk my life to defend your existence as a person in you. So you don't ever, unlike some people I say in your centrism, that you try individual, nearly said it long term. You don't try individual, otherwise, it's like eating a man or person's flesh. Suppose you found it sweet, you continue eating the whole nation or the whole world. So please, disabuse the word racism, racism as serious as it is in your culture, unfortunately, but which is consistent with irony, for which I'm sorry to say, British is transcendental through all social structures, that we disabuse such a, what can you go, that it is, I don't know what's the message, but it's also there, but it is unfortunate that you enjoy looking at somebody suffering and you intervene. I never do that in my activities. I always have been fighting, not because of my, but if anybody, especially a woman is attacked with a sexual disease, I intervene categorically to risk my life. Even the police, they call the police, I say, yes, call the police, you bastard, you are drunk and you love her, you beat her on the street. I say, intervene directly. That's my nature, that's my own, that's our bounties, especially women. Don't touch women, touch any other person, not a woman. Before anybody else, because nobody has been born through or by a woman. Please, I'm not here to preach, but you know what she goes through. And then look at America, what they try to say, that women cannot even have the ability to control. Who does a man control? How can you carry a man carry a child? And the pain, I know it. But please respect women, that's what I'm saying. But meanwhile, please stop being ironical and contrary to your beliefs when you know better than you can do. Thanks very much.
Just work. Oh, there we go. Yeah. Hi. So I'd just like to point out, particularly with the anti-vax movement, or the modern anti-vax movement, as the speaker rightly pointed out, the anti-vax movement is one of many conspiracy theories that's much older. It started with cowpox, like 1800, something like that. Not a historian, but I'm autistic. It's just the modern anti-vax movement seems to have sprung out of a paper that was released in 1998 by Dr. Andrew Wakefield, at least if Google is to be believed, certainly could be wrong on that. They made a correlation in that paper that was incorrect, but unfortunately the far right decided to, even though that's been disproven, use that in a divide and rule tactic, and it's very useful to them to keep us divided, and whether it's being anti-Semitic or being disablist, or like, you can see a pattern in that whenever a conspiracy theory appears, or at least certain types of conspiracy theories, they tend to revolve around, oh, it's this group of people, oh, it's that group of people, and it really highlights, I think, like I was saying, the divide and rule strategy that is used by the far right, and although conspiracy theories may not initially start like this, it certainly gets whipped up into it, and that's the main thing that we need to look at, amongst other things. And it's about critical thinking of the working class. So And the speaker also rightly pointed out about how conspiracy theories often lead you to a very isolationist point of view, and that's the point, is to keep people from each other. So they say divide and rule. I say unite and fight and join the Socialist Workers' Party today.
Yeah.
I've got to go, not because I can't enjoying the discussion, but I've got to be somewhere.
Okay, so
Nice to see a
look, I just think that
committee.
sorry, it's a bit distracting.
There were none in my day.
I think Julie's right to say that we shouldn't assume, just conflate the anti-vaxxer movement in Britain with the far right. They were certainly present, but actually, because we've beaten them off the streets in recent years, I think they had a weaker presence than they probably did in some other countries like Germany and so on. However, and this is the kind of point I want to make, I think we have to understand it as a warning, a very serious warning. And I think the underlying reason, building on some of the points that we've made, I think there is a deep crisis of liberalism, of liberal ideas. In other words, the idea that there's an underlying social harmony in society, that effort and talent will meet their just reward, that social mobility is available. That's never a reality, but had some purchase in the era, the golden age, the 1950s, 1960s, and so on, the economic boom. But it is so sharply at odds with the reality around us that it drives people to search for explanations, and that was whipped into a white heat during the pandemic, particularly as huge numbers of small property owners and layers could see their potential livelihoods just disappearing in front of them and so on. They search for explanations. And what's gone wrong? And for some people, the explanation between what is and what ought to be how society should be, but isn't, it can become that somehow some outside external force has mysteriously gained the power to corrupt society and poison the well of society. In other words, conspiracy ideas. And here's the warning, not only is that mistaken, but it's easy for the community to become the nation. The nation is in crisis. The outside element is an alien force outside the nation to be racialised. And that is a huge bridge to the kind of classic fascist worldview. You know, the fascists have often attracted support through racism. But this is much more the potential for the fully developed worldview of fascism, and that was the harden the layer of people around fascist ideas. I'm not saying that's gone that far, but you get a glimpse of how society in crisis can open the door for the sharp growth of those things. Now there's an alternative. There's an alternative, which is to say, actually there was never a golden era of social harmony. Society's always been divided by class, but we've gone through a capitalist system in boom to one in crisis, and the solution, therefore, is one of collective struggle, collective resistance, and collective empowerment. But I'll tell you what it means. It means the race between the far right and indeed the fascists and the left, as the centre ground crumbles, is going to intensify in the decades ahead. And that's why it's not just a question of organising outside. There's an urgency to building an alternative. Otherwise, the explanations can go off in anti-Semitic, racist, and indeed fascist directions.
The speaker's contribution was very, very nice. I just had one problem, given the fact that it was a bit reductionist, in the sense that anti-vaxxers are right-wing, and because I wouldn't call myself an anti-vaxxer, but I was against the vaccine, and I'm as left as they come. And primarily my reason for that was I saw the virus as an advanced version of the flu, which it actually is. People who succumbed to it had weaker immune systems, and I feel that, I don't think it's been discussed enough, because at the height of the pandemic, it was anathema. It was almost a hangable offense to say that the virus was something that you can prevent against by taking vitamins and minerals and whatnot, by eating healthily, by exercising or whatever. And that is the fact. If you have an underlying illness, then it's not going to be fatal. There are some caveats around that. But at the end of the day, what happened was the left, by going along with the narrative by the media, the left ceded the ground of challenging the narrative. They ceded that ground to the right, so the right capitalized on it. Because at the end of the day, I mean, what we have to realize, as the comrade there was saying, that the media is actually a capitalist media, and they actually report on what the government says. We've got the Libya crisis, the Gulf War, all the major crises in our lives, as the mainstream media reported from the perspective of the government. And I think that we have to be grown up about this. I mean, the virus is very dangerous. It's fatal in a lot of cases, but it's something that we can protect ourselves against. And I think because the left took hook, line, and sinker what the mainstream media said, so they ceded ground to the right. And then if you look at what happened, actually, the comrade was talking about capital accumulation. Capital accumulation actually happened. I mean, the PPE, them awarding contracts to their friends. I think research has to be done by people who have the resources. They enrich themselves, I mean, with this thing. That's why they want a blanket vaccination for everyone. I agree that those at-risk groups should have been vaccinated, but the blanket vaccination was to get more capital for them to accumulate. Thank you.
Okay, but I'm just going to put in here at the front. I'm really sorry to anyone who doesn't get to speak, but there's been so many hands up.
Yeah, just a couple of things really. I mean, I think the first thing is I don't think the speaker did argue that everybody who bought into some of the ideas around vaxx was just simply right wing, right? Because I think what people struggled with was a narrative that they could make sense of. Boris Johnson says that that COVID is a big threat, and yet Boris Johnson is in a party drinking wine and stuff, and not just one occasion, but on several. Karen can be fined £10,000 for demonstrating overpay, but Boris Johnson is fined 50 quid for the other things. So actually what people are looking at is a situation that doesn't make sense to them, right, stuff over it. So we're not just saying that everybody who took up those arguments was simply right wing at all. What we're saying is it's a very complex situation. And I think that partly as well, one of the things, I mean, Judy talked about the way that arguments around the potential sacking of health workers came in. Actually, I know health workers in London who went on to what we would describe as an anti-vax demonstration. They went on to the demonstration because they believed that the unions weren't taking a firm enough stand in defence of those workers. In other words, what I think were fundamentally right-wing ideas inside the leadership of that demonstration began to filter into the working class because the working class wasn't taking a militant enough response. Now actually, when the working class stands up over issues like COVID, when it shuts down schools, when it refuses to let our people be bloody slaughtered, right stuff, that's when people can look to an alternative strategy around it, right? So we don't think working class people are stupid, right stuff. We think actually what they're doing is struggling to understand the world around them, and if they're pulled to a collective solution, it's because our side is offering the collective solution. When you talk about what the far right are trying to do inside these movements and stuff over it, they're trying to relate to that anguish, right stuff, and actually the fear of what the ruling class is capable of. Why is it that many black communities haven't bought in, right stuff, to the idea of the vaccine? Well, because actually black communities have been treated like shit at every level, right? But also around testing, other things in the past. So it's people's actual experience that opens them up to this argument stuff around it. And actually, when you think about the whole kind of conspiracy theories, mysticism, all the rest of it stuff, fascism was always trying to use those ideas, always trying to pull together a false and non-existent community, right, stuff that working class people can be part of against the collective community that they belong to as a class inside the trade unions and inside the socialist movement. So I think it's right stuff at the minute. You've got a society that no longer makes sense. And if a society no longer makes sense, other explanations, much more radical explanations, are going to come forward. And they've got a way of doing it. They want to break into working class heartlands. People like Tommy Robinson, other people lose this shit, and we know internationally they've been much more successful and stuff because the fascist movements are stronger. We've got to make sure that our pole of attraction, a rational explanation to why society works the way it does, exploitation, the accumulation of wealth by the bastards like Johnson, of our families go to be buried with about us getting to the bloody funerals, right, stuff during that process is there. And actually there is a massive opening amongst working class people under that basis because they're angry and they want a serious explanation. But socialists have to offer it. It's a problem for us is Starmers and people don't give a serious picture of the world. We need a more radical, a revolutionary explanation of the world in order to make sure working class people are pulled towards collectivist ideas and aren't pulled to the right.
Thank you very much. I'm so sorry to everybody who didn't get to contribute. There's about 10 hands that I couldn't actually call in, but the discussions will continue through the weekend, and it's been a brilliant discussion. Just one quick announcement is to make sure that you get along to the rally at 7 o'clock in the Great Hall. We've got speakers from the RMT who are on strike. We've got abortion rights campaigners from the US. We've got Romani campaigners. It's going to be an absolutely a brilliant rally, and so don't miss it, 7 o'clock in the Great Hall. But other than that, I'm just going to hand over to Julie for the last there.
Okay, thanks. Hopefully the mic will stick with us. It was a really interesting discussion, and thanks to everybody who contributed. And I think Michael did cover a lot of what I was going to say in response, but I just would like to reiterate that really it is not the case that I think that everybody who doesn't agree with the vaccine, didn't get vaccinated, has a scepticism about it. The people that are going on even on these demonstrations at all are all far right. But to come back to kind of what Mark also mentioned is that I think that we have to recognise that the space that that those mobilisations are offering and is a space where the far right are trying to organise, and it is an issue that they've tried to mobilise over. I think. Just on the Australia example, like I've got some of the balance of the detail of it wrong. So if I have about the nature of the union or that kind of thing, then you can correct me on that afterwards. But my sort of general point was, I suppose, about the question of the state, the question of the left response, and the question of how the far right are trying to use these spaces. And so, for example, I don't think that it was an automatic thing when the question came up here in Britain about the NHS mandate and so on. There was an enormous logic that felt quite strong to the idea that surely health workers, if you agree with that, should have the vaccine, but precisely because we don't want to hand that into the hands of the state, and we don't want to put the state in a position where they're able to simultaneously fail to provide PPE, lead to people dying at work because they don't protect them, but then at the same time fine health workers or force them into a position where people perhaps like yourself or others who had a whole number of reasons for why they might not be convinced about getting the vaccine, legitimate reasons and so on, that they should not be forced by the state to do that or lose their job. And so that kind of if the Australian example was a bad one that I mixed up, then I apologise about that. But that was my understanding of it, was that it kind of highlighted the danger that precisely because the far right are vying for that ground, are vying for that space, and precisely because what the speaker over here talked about the the failure of liberal politics to answer any of these questions for people, that we can't leave that ground, and we have to come up with solutions that are class based and are about challenging the state and the system and what it's doing. I suppose just to kind of sum up, I suppose. It's an interesting discussion, and it will definitely continue, over the course of the festival and stuff. But I think one of the things as well is that there's this kind of sort of milieu of forces, from racist populism to fascist organisations that are trying out different methods of how they can grow, to far right forces. Trumpism has certainly been an enormous boost to all those forces, and the crisis of the system and the attacks on working class people and the experience of life that doesn't make any sense to people anymore and that people can't really exist under anymore is radicalising people and forcing them to look for solutions, and that creates a space for the far right to grow. And one of the common areas, the common ground that all those forces, despite their differences on the right, are vying for between themselves. You saw it in the French elections in the first round in the build-up, where you had fascist Le Pen trying to kind of rebrand herself and find a way to gain votes, but also she was actually facing flank from her in a sense from her right, from the far right candidate Zemmour in the build-up to the elections, who was trying to be even more virulently anti-Muslim or anti-migrant and so on. And so there's this process going on where they are all kind of vying for that space of how racist that they can be, and other issues as well. And I think that this is part of why we see the Johnson cabinet launching like an incredible intensification of their hostile environment. I mean, if you speak to people from Care for Cali or the PCS union who have been involved in the legal challenge to the Rwanda flights and the challenging of the Nationality and Borders Act, they kind of sum it up by saying, in 1956, there was international policy that said, refugees had a right to flee and to have to have sanctuary and so on, and now this act is going to basically get rid of that. It's an enormous attack. When already the hostile environment was incredibly racist, and it was very, very difficult. This is going to affect something like 99% of the people trying to seek asylum and find somewhere safe to live and exist would be classified as using illegal routes. There are no legal routes. This is an enormous attack, and as part of, I think, the backlash that this Tory government is trying to enforce in the wake of the BLM movement. So I think that this common ground that they're vying for, it's also, the Tories are trying to push these attacks because obviously, there's now a cost of living crisis. People are, I'm terrified to see what my own electricity bills are going to look like after seeing some screenshots of some other people's on social media like this month. So, people are getting really, really hardly hit after a long, long time of austerity, of pay being frozen. I think that's why you've got such an incredible excitement over the RMT strike, because it's, and the boldness, Mick Lynch, it's been great to watch Mick Lynch on the news, but what we have to say is we want hundreds and thousands of people who are behaving like Mick Lynch in the face of those arguments and unapologetically defending collective working class struggle to fight, for a different kind of world. And I think that, that's what we have to link in the anti-racist movement to the fight for strikes and for greater resistance. But we have to understand as well that, that the far right are organised, the racists are organised, and they are trying to build organisations that are going to fight inside the movement to win people to the racist ideas, to the divisive ideas, to even fascist ideas, and that we have to do the same. We have to have organisation inside the working class movement that can explain the crisis system, that can explain that these problems are rooted inside, explain and engage, of course, and learn, how these problems are rooted inside the system, and that we need and can have and do have the power to win a different kind of world. So I think people should join. If you're not a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, we are an organisation that is trying to do that, and we would love to, learn from new members and new experiences of people who could get involved and help shape the fight for that organisation for a better world.